The room was supposed to be routine, a hearing like dozens before. But when Senator John Kennedy leaned forward, his question carried a weight that silenced even the cameras. He asked about leaks, classified information that had made its way into the press. And he didn't ask just anyone. He asked Adam Schiff, the man accused of knowing more than he should. Schiff adjusted his glasses, but the pause was louder than anything he could say. Don't miss what came next. Hit like, subscribe, and stay until the end. Because the moment Schiff stayed silent, the whole chamber shifted. The hearing began like any other, with the usual introductions, the stiff language of procedure, and the illusion of control. Rows of aides shuffled papers, reporters leaned over their laptops, and the panel sat tall, rehearsed, and careful. At least, that was the plan. Kennedy sat a little back, hands folded, his eyes not darting like others. He had something in his folder. No one knew what, but it wasn't the folder that carried the tension. It was the way he waited. Adam Schiff, known for his sharp tongue and careful threading of words, seemed comfortable at first. He delivered his opening remarks with the practiced cadence of someone used to headlines. He spoke of oversight, of responsibility, of trust in government. Every phrase polished, every gesture restrained. The kind of delivery that fills the time, but leaves no room for cracks. But cracks were already there, because Kennedy wasn't interested in Schiff's performance. He wasn't listening for what was said. He was watching for what wasn't. The cameras caught it too, Schiff's hand resting just a second too long on his notes, his eyes moving not left to right across his page, but flicking toward the press row in the corner. These were not mistakes, not to anyone else. But Kennedy saw them. He had built a career on noticing what others missed. And so, when the moment arrived for his time, he leaned forward, not with a flourish, not with theatrics, but with the kind of calm that made the air change. Congressman Schiff, Kennedy began, his voice steady, carrying the Louisiana drawl that always made him underestimated. Leaks, national security leaks, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone in this chamber, someone with access, made sure those details reached the front page of a newspaper. The room tightened. Reporters looked up from their laptops. The shuffle of papers froze. Even the sound crew behind the cameras stopped moving as though Kennedy's words had locked the air in place. And you, sir, Kennedy continued, have been mentioned more than once as the man who seemed to know before the rest of us. I'm asking, plain and simple, did you? It was not a question wrapped in legal language. It was not softened by courtesy. It was a question shaped like a blade. Schiff smiled, thin and practiced, the kind of smile that said he'd heard accusations before. But this one was different, because it wasn't shouted in a press conference. It wasn't buried in a late-night interview. It was in the chamber, on record, with the cameras rolling. Kennedy didn't blink. The silence stretched. Schiff lifted his papers as though the answer might be printed there. He adjusted his glasses, coughed lightly, and began a sentence that trailed off before it even started. Senator, I think we both know. He stopped. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, tilting his head, leaving the pause wide open for everyone watching. That was when the temperature in the chamber shifted. The formality of the hearing cracked. Because silence wasn't neutral. Silence was admission. The reporters caught it. Pens scratched faster across notebooks. Aides whispered in each other's ears, some leaning forward, others leaning back as though trying to avoid being noticed by association. And Schiff didn't have an answer. Not one that would survive outside the chamber. Kennedy leaned back slowly, letting the silence expand until it pressed against every wall. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to gloat. All he needed was the question and the silence that followed. It wasn't the end of the exchange, not yet, but it was the beginning of something bigger. Because in Washington, the first crack is never the last. The silence couldn't last forever. Not in a room wired for performance, not in a chamber where every pause risked becoming its own headline. Schiff knew that. He'd made a career out of turning silence into speeches, of filling uncomfortable gaps with words so polished that people forgot to notice the point had never been answered. So when Kennedy's question hung in the air like an uninvited guest, Schiff leaned forward, straightened his tie, and reached for the tool he always carried. Deflection. Senator, he began, his tone even, rehearsed, steady. I think we both understand the danger of politicizing sensitive matters. National security is not a talking point. To suggest otherwise is, but Kennedy didn't move, didn't blink. He let Schiff talk, let him layer the words like bricks, one on top of another, trying to wall himself in from the question. The cameras caught the change in the room. Reporters, who had been silent, started typing again, their fingers fast, some smirking, some raising eyebrows. Because everyone recognized the move. Schiff wasn't answering, he was pivoting. And Kennedy? Kennedy just waited. His silence was more powerful than Schiff's sentences. Finally, Schiff tightened his lips and delivered the line he thought would end it. Leaks, Senator, are an unfortunate reality in this city, but to imply that I would be directly involved that is not only false, it's beneath the dignity of this committee. He sat back as though the line would settle the room, as though words about dignity and falsehood would do what silence hadn't. But it didn't land, because Kennedy leaned in again, elbows on the desk, and smiled just slightly. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that told the room, I was waiting for that. Beneath the dignity of this committee, Kennedy repeated softly, his drawl making the phrase slower, heavier. Congressman, what's beneath the dignity of this committee is a question asked in plain English that doesn't get a plain answer. The chamber shifted again. This time the laugh line Schiff expected never came. No one clapped, no one shook their head in sympathy. The reporters didn't scribble his words down like they were lines worth preserving. Instead, all attention swung back to Kennedy. Because the drawl, the pause, the way he dropped plain English, that wasn't a line rehearsed for the cameras. It was a cut delivered in real time. Schiff exhaled through his nose, tapping his pencil against the table, and tried again. Leaks happen across administrations, he said, rushing now, trying to broaden the frame. We've seen them in Republican offices, Democratic offices, from staffers, from outside actors. To single me out here is, well, it's politics, Senator, nothing more. And that's when Kennedy tilted his head. Politics, Kennedy repeated, the word low, almost amused. Well, sir, sometimes politics is just the word we use when we don't want to say truth. The air froze, the microphones caught it clean, the sentence echoing slightly across the marble walls. Schiff stopped tapping his pencil. Aides looked at one another without speaking. Because Schiff's line, the one he thought would shield him, had backfired. Kennedy had flipped it. What was meant to make Kennedy look like the one playing games had instead exposed Schiff as the man dodging the answer. The reporters knew it. The viewers watching later would know it. And Schiff himself, his eyes gave him away. He knew it too. Kennedy didn't press further. Not yet. He let the silence settle again, heavier now, because silence after a failed defense doesn't feel neutral. It feels like defeat. And that was only the second part of the exchange. The chamber hadn't even heard the worst yet. It wasn't just Kennedy's drawl or his pauses anymore. It was the weapon every seasoned lawyer saves for the exact second the other side starts leaning on air instead of facts. A name, because a name can't be brushed away with a speech. It can't be disguised in broad language. A name is a spotlight, and once it's said out loud, everyone has to look. Kennedy leaned back slightly, his voice lower now, but steady enough to pierce the room. Congressman, you mentioned leaks. You mentioned how they happen across administrations. That's all fine and good. But tell me something plain. When classified materials started showing up in the press last winter, why did every reporter's notes trace back to meetings you were in? The pause broke the room open. Heads turned. Staffers froze mid-note. Cameras zoomed in. Because Kennedy hadn't accused him outright. He hadn't used the word guilty, but he had spoken a name. Schiff's name in the same breath as the leaks themselves. Schiff's face didn't redden. He was too practiced for that. But his jaw clenched, the slightest movement that the cameras magnified into a story of its own. He adjusted his microphone, cleared his throat, and leaned forward as if his weight alone would hold the room steady. That's an insinuation, Senator, he replied, his voice measured but thinner now. And I'll not dignify insinuations. Reporters write what they want. They speculate. They frame things for headlines. That doesn't mean, but Kennedy didn't let him finish. For For the first time in the hearing, he cut in, voice sharp. I didn't ask about reporters' frames. I asked about the meetings you were in. The repetition hit like a hammer. Same words, slower, heavier, undeniable. Reporters looked at one another. This wasn't deflection anymore. This was a question that had a narrow door, and Schiff either had to walk through it or stand outside, exposed. Schiff tried again, this time with more urgency. Senator, you're asking me to comment on internal discussions that... Kennedy leaned in, his tone almost mocking now, but never leaving its calm register. No, sir, I'm asking you to comment on yourself, the discussions you sat in, the ones that somehow just happened to mirror what the press published. The room went still again. Schiff pressed his lips tight, and the silence that followed was worse than any outburst could have been. Because silence in that chamber reads like confession. Someone in the back coughed. A staffer dropped a pen. The microphones picked up Schiff's faint exhale. And Kennedy? He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound the table. He just sat back and let the quiet do the work. Because everyone watching knew, once a name is dropped, once the dots are connected aloud, you can't unhear it. And Schiff's name had just been tied to something he could not explain. The reporters typed faster now, headlines forming before the hearing was even over. Kennedy put Schiff on spot over leaks. Schiff can't answer directly. The name that hung in the room. By now the air in the chamber was different. Schiff had dodged, he had hedged, and Kennedy had already tied his name to the leaks. But what Kennedy did next was what nobody, not even Schiff's own staffers, saw coming. Kennedy reached into his folder, slowly, deliberately, not with a pile of papers or a thick binder, but with just one sheet, a single page. He held it up between two fingers so that the cameras could catch the header. Internal distribution. Restricted. The whisper moved across the room like a ripple. Because if there was one thing reporters, aides, and politicians all knew, it was this. Headers like that didn't leak by accident. They came from someone in the room. Kennedy didn't unfold it. He didn't shove it in Schiff's face. Instead, he rested it flat on the desk, tapped it once, and said, Congressman, this is a document that circulated in a closed-door meeting you attended. 3 days later, nearly word for word, its language appeared in a front-page article. Are you telling this committee that's a coincidence? The camera zoomed in. Schiff looked down for the briefest second, then straightened. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen it. The glance downward, the quick flash of recognition. He tried to recover. Senator, I don't know what document you're holding, but if you're implying... Kennedy cut him off, his drawl turning razor sharp. I'm not implying anything. I'm reading the header. Restricted distribution. You were there. You had it. And the press had it the next week. That's not an implication, Congressman. That's a chain of custody. The phrase landed heavy. Chain of custody. Lawyers in the room leaned forward. Staffers scribbled notes. Schiff blinked hard, his mouth half open, searching for a response that didn't exist. He tried again, voice cracking at the edge of frustration. Senator, you're making leaps that are unfair. But Kennedy didn't move. He tapped the document again, softer this time, almost casual. I don't leap, Congressman. I read. And the American people can read too. This page says restricted. The press had it. That means someone walked it out. And you're sitting here pretending you don't know how? The silence that followed wasn't just tense, it was suffocating. Schiff's team shifted uncomfortably behind him. One aide bit her lip, staring at the floor. The cameras captured every twitch, every eye movement. Reporters in the back started drafting headlines in real time. Kennedy produces document Schiff won't answer for. Chain of custody, Kennedy's line that cornered Schiff. And then Kennedy delivered the quietest line of the day. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, but the microphones caught every syllable. You can't tell me it wasn't you, not without looking this country in the eye. So go ahead, look right here. Tell America who walked it out. The room froze. Schiff didn't look at him, didn't look at the cameras. He adjusted his tie, shuffled a paper, anything to avoid the eye contact Kennedy demanded. And that, more than any document, was what sealed it. Because you can argue against a paper, you can spin a story, but when you won't even meet the gaze of the man across from you, America doesn't need words. They see the answer in the silence. For Kennedy, it was a surgical strike. For Schiff, it was the moment that would replay on screens all night long. When the silence stretched too long, Schiff did what seasoned politicians always do. He pivoted. He reached for the one lifeline left in moments like this: distraction. "Senator," he began, his tone firm but rehearsed, "I think the real issue here isn't who leaked a draft memo, but how we protect the integrity of the entire process moving forward." It sounded measured, polished, the kind of line that works on cable interviews. But in that chamber, it rang hollow. Because everyone knew what he was doing. He wasn't answering Kennedy's question. He was trying to escape it. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't even change his posture. He just tilted his head and said softly, "Protecting the process begins with telling the truth about what already happened. Don't you agree?" The pivot faltered. Schiff tried again, tightening his grip on the microphone. "This hearing isn't about scoring political points, Senator. It's about serious issues, and I think America wants us focused on solutions, not sideshows." That line was supposed to sting, to brand Kennedy's move as theater. But Kennedy smiled, just faintly, and leaned back. His reply came slow, deliberate, wrapped in the drawl that carried weight because it wasn't rushed. "Congressman, the only sideshow here is a senior lawmaker trying to pretend the public can't read. These words," he tapped the restricted page again, "didn't print themselves. And the press didn't dream them up. Someone walked them out. That's not a distraction. That's the heart of the matter." The chamber shifted. Reporters smelled blood. The pivot had not just failed, it had backfired. Because Kennedy wasn't letting go. Schiff's jaw tensed. He shuffled his stack of papers, trying to project composure, but the cameras caught the twitch in his hand. He looked down at his notes, then back up, as if waiting for an aide to jump in and rescue him. But there was no rescue. Kennedy pressed again. "You called this about protecting integrity. Then let's test that. Can you tell this room under oath that no one in your office carried this page to the press?" The pivot had been shattered. The room leaned in. Schiff froze, lips parting, but no words forming quickly enough. The hesitation was lethal. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply folded the page back into his folder and said, "I'll let the pause answer." And just like that, the pivot Schiff had reached for, the polished deflection, the attempt to shift blame to the process, crumbled in his hands. The cameras didn't capture a confident congressman protecting democracy. They captured a man cornered, fumbling with silence, while his opponent sat calm, steady, and unshaken. In politics, sometimes the loudest blow isn't a shout. It's a quiet moment when the pivot fails and the nation sees it. By now, the hearing wasn't about leaks in the abstract. It wasn't about process, integrity, or the polished lines Schiff had rehearsed. It had boiled down to a single exchange. One man asking straight questions, the other avoiding straight answers. And Kennedy knew it. That's why he waited. He didn't rush to close. He let Schiff shuffle his papers, clear his throat, and try to reframe the room. The congressman leaned on phrases like moving forward and protecting democracy. But none of it landed. The earlier silence still clung to him. That's when Kennedy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice measured and calm. "Congressman, let me put it plain. If it wasn't you and it wasn't your staff, then who was it?" The question hung in the air like a blade. It wasn't long, it wasn't layered, it was direct. And it was the one question Schiff couldn't spin, because to answer it meant pointing fingers. To dodge it meant admitting he had no control. For a long moment, Schiff blinked at his notes. His lips tightened. He tried to reframe. "Senator, I don't deal in speculation, I deal in facts. And the fact is..." But Kennedy cut in gently, almost like a teacher correcting a student. "No, sir. Facts are exactly what I'm asking for. A page left this chamber. That's a fact. If you won't name who, then you're telling us something just as loud. That you can't or you won't." Gasps flickered across the room. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching faster. Schiff shifted again, trying to sit taller, but the weight of the moment pressed him down. He glanced sideways toward his aides, but no one moved. No one could help. And then came the silence. A silence that stretched long enough for every camera to capture the hesitation, every microphone to record the lack of answer. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed the folder back on the table, smoothed it with his palm, and said, "Congressman, the country's listening." And so far, all they've heard is nothing. It was devastating in its simplicity, because while Schiff tried to protect himself with polished pivots, Kennedy had saved the bluntest question for the very end. A question that no amount of rhetoric could dodge, no pivot could cover. The reaction wasn't immediate outrage, it was worse. It was the cold realization in the chamber that one side had spoken plainly, and the other had been trapped in silence. Schiff looked down, eyes scanning the paper in front of him, but everyone knew he wasn't reading anymore. He was stalling, waiting for a clock to run out. And Kennedy knew it too. He sat still, letting the silence answer for him. By the time the gavel finally tapped, the hearing wasn't remembered for opening statements or the official agenda. It was remembered for one question that hung in the air. Unanswered, unshakable. The question Kennedy had saved for last. The gavel fell, but the sound didn't end anything. If anything, it made the silence worse. The air in the chamber felt heavy because everyone knew what had just happened. Kennedy had asked the one question that couldn't be answered, and Schiff had sat in it. Outside those doors, cameras were already rolling. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, but their words carried an edge. Schiff couldn't answer. Kennedy cornered him. The leak is now the story. What Kennedy had done wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud. It was surgical. He'd stripped away every layer of deflection until only the silence remained. And that silence told the country everything. By nightfall, clips of the exchange were running everywhere, replayed on the evening news, looping on social media, broken down frame by frame. Viewers didn't need commentary. They saw Schiff pause, stumble, and freeze. They heard Kennedy's calm voice, cutting through with one line. "If you won't name who, then you're telling us something just as loud, that you can't or you won't." That sentence echoed. It didn't need repeating because it repeated itself in headlines and conversations in living rooms across the country. And Kennedy, he didn't do a victory lap. He didn't call a press conference. He simply left the chamber the same way he entered it, calm, unhurried, almost as though he'd expected the ending all along. That calmness made it sting more, because it wasn't triumph, it was certainty. The claim that someone in power had leaked what was never meant for daylight couldn't go back into the box. Not after it was spoken, not after the silence confirmed it. It would live on, not just as a question unanswered, but as a truth everyone now suspected. And in that cold close, Kennedy reminded the country of something simple. Sometimes the loudest line in politics is the one never answered. If you think Kennedy's calm question cut sharper than a speech, hit like. If you want to see the next exchange they tried to bury, subscribe now.